How a surprise attack by Japan on the United States naval base killed 2,403 soldiers. December 7, 1941. 7:55 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to warm the waters of a peaceful Hawaiian harbor when the sky suddenly erupted with the roar of over 300 aircraft. Sailors below were drinking their morning coffee. Some were writing letters home. Others were still asleep in their bunks. None of them knew that in the next 2 hours, their entire world would be consumed by fire, chaos, and a fury so devastating that it would change the course of human history forever. This is not just a story about war. This is the story of the morning that turned the tide of the Second World War, when a single surprise attack ignited America's rage and transformed a distant conflict into a global inferno that would claim over 60 million lives. The stage for this catastrophe was set years before that fateful Sunday morning. To understand how this attack came to be, we must travel back to the roots of tension between two nations on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. Japan, a proud island empire with ancient warrior traditions, had been expanding its territory throughout Asia since the early 1930s. They had invaded Manchuria in 1931, then launched a brutal campaign in China in 1937. The Japanese military believed in their destiny to rule what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast empire that would liberate Asia from Western colonial powers and unite it under Japanese leadership. But there was a problem. Japan was a resource-poor nation. It had almost no oil, limited iron ore, and depended heavily on imports to fuel its military expansion. The United States, watching Japan's aggressive moves with growing alarm, decided to take action. Throughout 1940 and 1941, America imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions on Japan. They froze Japanese assets, banned the export of aviation fuel, and eventually cut off all oil shipments to the empire. For Japan, this was an existential threat. Without oil, their navy would be stranded, their air force grounded, and their dreams of empire would crumble. The Japanese leadership faced an impossible choice. They could back down, withdraw from China, and accept humiliation, or they could fight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, was a brilliant strategist who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power better than most of his colleagues. Yamamoto knew that in a prolonged war Japan would lose. America's factories could outproduce Japan's by a ratio of 10 to 1. But he also saw one narrow path to victory. If Japan could deliver a devastating blow to the United States Pacific Fleet, they might buy themselves 6 months to a year to consolidate their conquests in Southeast Asia. In that time they could seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, and the resources they desperately needed. Perhaps, Yamamoto hoped, America would negotiate a peace rather than fight a long and costly war across the Pacific. So began one of the most audacious military operations ever conceived. The target was Pearl Harbor, the main base of the United States Pacific Fleet on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The harbor was home to 8 battleships, the pride of the American Navy. These massive warships, each displacing over 30,000 tons and bristling with 14-inch guns, were the backbone of American naval power. If Japan could destroy them, the Pacific would be open for conquest. Planning for the attack began in early 1941. It was an operation of staggering complexity. The striking force would have to cross over 3,000 miles of open ocean without being detected. They would have to maintain absolute radio silence while coordinating 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers and 3 submarines. The attack would require specially modified aerial torpedoes that could run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, armor-piercing bombs converted from battleship shells, and months of intensive training for the pilots who would have to fly through defensive fire to hit their targets. Japanese intelligence officers worked tirelessly to gather information about Pearl Harbor. A spy named Takeo Yoshikawa, posing as a diplomat at the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, spent months carefully observing the harbor. He took tourist flights over Oahu, noting the positions of ships and the patterns of American military activity. He discovered that the Pacific Fleet followed a predictable schedule, with most warships in port on weekends. He mapped out the locations of fuel tanks, repair facilities, and the placement of anti-aircraft guns. Every detail was photographed, sketched, and sent back to Tokyo. By November, the plan was ready. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo was placed in command of the strike force. On November 26, 1941, his fleet departed from Hido-Kapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands. They took a northern route, traveling through cold, foggy waters where merchant shipping was rare. Every ship maintained strict radio silence. Even garbage was retained on board rather than being dumped overboard, where it might give away their position. The fleet refueled at sea from tankers, a dangerous operation in rough waters. For 12 days they steamed eastward, undetected by American surveillance. Meanwhile, in Washington and Honolulu, warning signs were mounting, but no one put the pieces together. American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and could read their messages. In late November, they intercepted communications indicating that Japan was preparing for war. A message to Japanese diplomats in Washington ordered them to destroy their code machines and prepare to leave. War warnings were sent to American commanders in the Pacific. But where would Japan strike? The Philippines seemed most likely. Perhaps Malaya. Maybe the Panama Canal. Few imagined that Japan would dare to attack the heavily defended naval base at Pearl Harbor, over 4,000 miles from Japan itself. On the evening of December 6, the Japanese strike force reached its launch point 230 miles north of Oahu. Crews made final preparations throughout the night. Pilots wrote farewell letters to their families, not knowing if they would return. Torpedoes and bombs were loaded onto aircraft. Mechanics performed last-minute checks on engines. Admiral Nagumo faced a final decision. Should he launch the attack or should he turn back? If American carriers were in port, this could be a devastating victory. But Japanese reconnaissance had reported that the carriers were at sea. Still, 8 battleships remained in the harbor. Nagumo gave the order. The attack would proceed. At 6 o'clock on the morning of December 7, the first wave of 183 aircraft began launching from the carrier decks. 43 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 Nakajima torpedo bombers roared into the dawn sky. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the attack force, flying through clouds and overcast skies toward Oahu. As they approached the island, the clouds broke, and Fukuda saw the target spread out below him like a detailed model. The battleships were lined up along the southeast shore of Ford Island, exactly where intelligence had predicted. He gave the signal. At 7:49, his radio operator transmitted the code words, "Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." The surprise was complete. At that moment, most of the 25,000 military personnel stationed at Pearl Harbor were engaged in ordinary Sunday morning activities. Many were still sleeping. Others were eating breakfast in the mess halls. Some attended religious services. A few were preparing for shore leave. The weather was pleasant, with scattered clouds and a light breeze. It seemed like a perfect day. Then the sky fell upon them. The first bomb struck at 7:55. The initial target was the Naval Air Station on Ford Island. Zeros strafed the airfields, destroying American planes lined up wing to wing on the runways. Within minutes, most of America's fighter aircraft in Hawaii were blazing wrecks, unable to mount any defense. Then the torpedo bombers swept in low across the water, skimming just above the waves at speeds of 200 miles per hour. They released their weapons at distances of less than 500 yards from their targets. Modified Type 91 torpedoes, specially designed with wooden fins to run in shallow water, streaked through the harbor toward the battleships. The USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in quick succession on her port side. The massive explosions tore open her hull below the waterline. Within minutes she began to roll. Sailors trapped inside scrambled toward any exit they could find as the ship capsized. Men crawled along bulkheads that were becoming floors, then ceilings as the world turned upside down. Some made it out through portholes. Others were trapped in compartments that filled with oily water. The Oklahoma rolled completely over, her hull settling into the mud with her masts touching the harbor bottom. 429 men died inside her. The USS West Virginia took 7 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. Her captain, Mervyn Benyon, was mortally wounded on the bridge by shrapnel from an explosion on the nearby USS Tennessee. As fires raged and the ship settled into the shallow water, damage control teams fought desperately to save her. Ensign Victor Delano and a cook named Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant who had never been trained on weapons, carried the dying captain to a safer location. Then Miller manned an anti-aircraft gun, firing at Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition. His actions that day would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African-American heroes of World War II. But the most catastrophic moment was yet to come. At 8:10, a high-level bomber scored a direct hit on the forward magazine of the USS Arizona. The bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell weighing over a ton, penetrated the deck and detonated among the ammunition stores. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the 32,000-ton battleship out of the water. A fireball erupted hundreds of feet into the air, and a blast wave radiated across the harbor. Men on nearby ships were thrown to the deck by the concussion. The Arizona's entire forward section was obliterated in an instant. Within 9 minutes, the ship sank to the bottom of the harbor. Of the 1,500 men aboard, 1,177 died, most killed instantly in the explosion. It was the single greatest loss of life on any ship in American naval history. All around the harbor, sailors fought back with whatever weapons they could reach. Anti-aircraft crews who had survived the initial attacks manned their guns, sending streams of tracer fire into the sky. Some men grabbed rifles and pistols, firing at low-flying aircraft with small arms. Others formed bucket brigades to fight fires that threatened to spread to fuel tanks and ammunition magazines. In the water, rescue boats pulled survivors from the oil-slicked surface, which in many places was burning. Men swam through flames, their skin blistering from the heat, desperate to reach safety. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, attempted to escape the harbor. She had taken a torpedo hit early in the battle but managed to raise steam and slip her moorings. As she headed for the channel leading to open water, Japanese pilots saw an opportunity. If they could sink her in the narrow channel, they would block the entire harbor, trapping the rest of the fleet. Dive bombers swarmed the Nevada, hitting her repeatedly. Realizing the danger, the ship's officers deliberately ran her aground rather than risk sinking in the channel. She settled onto Hospital Point, her decks ablaze but her hull intact. At 8:40 there was a brief lull in the attacks. The first wave had expended its weapons and turned back toward the carriers. Sailors used this precious time to rescue wounded, fight fires, and prepare for what they knew was coming next. In the harbor, rescue crews cut through steel hulls with torches, trying to reach men trapped in overturned ships. From inside the capsized Oklahoma, they could hear the desperate hammering of survivors. Some were rescued. Others were never reached in time. At 8:54 the second wave arrived. 171 aircraft swept over Oahu. This wave consisted of high-level bombers and dive bombers, along with more Zero fighters. They found a harbor already thick with smoke from burning ships and oil. Many targets were obscured, making precise bombing more difficult. The attackers shifted their focus to ships that were still operational, dry docks and support facilities. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was in dry dock and took bomb hits that caused significant damage. The destroyers Cassin and Downs, in the same dry dock, were hit repeatedly and burned so intensely that they melted into masses of twisted metal. By 9:45, it was over. The last Japanese aircraft departed, leaving behind a scene of devastation that seemed beyond comprehension. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers were heavily damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed. And most tragically, 2,403 Americans were dead, with another 1,178 wounded. But Admiral Nagumo made a crucial decision that would later be seen as a strategic mistake. His staff officers urged him to launch a third wave to destroy the fuel storage tanks, repair facilities and submarine base. These were the installations that would allow Pearl Harbor to continue functioning as a naval base. But Nagumo, concerned about the location of the American aircraft carriers and worried about a counterattack, decided to withdraw. The Japanese strike force turned back toward Japan, having achieved a tactical victory but missing the opportunity for a truly crippling blow. The aftermath of the attack was a mixture of grief, shock, and rage. As news spread across America, the reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech lasted just over 7 minutes, but it would become one of the most famous in American history. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist, voted against the declaration. Within days, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. America was now fully committed to the Second World War. The attack unified the American public in a way that perhaps no other event could have. Before Pearl Harbor, the nation was deeply divided about involvement in the war. Isolationists argued that Europe's conflicts were not America's problem. But after the attack, those divisions evaporated. Young men lined up at recruiting stations in such numbers that many had to be turned away and told to come back later. Factories that had been producing automobiles and consumer goods retooled for war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had gone to fight. The entire nation mobilized with a determination and unity of purpose that would prove unstoppable. In the immediate aftermath at Pearl Harbor, the work of recovery and rebuilding began. Salvage crews labored for months to raise sunken ships. The Oklahoma, capsized on that terrible Sunday, was eventually righted in an extraordinary engineering effort. The West Virginia and California, both sunk in the shallow harbor, were raised, repaired, and returned to service. They would go on to fight in the war, gaining revenge against the Japanese fleet. Even the Nevada, badly damaged and run aground, was refloated, repaired, and went on to serve throughout the war, participating in the D-Day landings and the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Only 2 battleships were total losses. The Arizona remains on the harbor floor to this day, a memorial to the men who died aboard her. Oil still seeps from her ruptured fuel tanks, rising to the surface in what some call the tears of the Arizona. The USS Arizona Memorial, built over the sunken ship in 1962, is visited by millions of people who come to honor the sacrifice of those who died there. The human stories from that day are countless and profound. There were stories of extraordinary heroism. Chief Boatswain's Mate John Finn, despite being wounded over 20 times, manned a machine gun in a completely exposed position for hours, shooting at attacking aircraft. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. 15 other men received the Medal of Honor for their actions that day. There were stories of tragic fate. 64 sets of brothers served on ships at Pearl Harbor. 34 of them lost a brother that day. On the Arizona alone, 23 sets of brothers were serving. In most cases, both perished. And there were stories that revealed the true cost of war. A sailor named Lester Rasmussen survived the sinking of the Arizona but lost his brother. A young man named Russell McCurdy survived the Oklahoma, only to learn that his twin brother had died aboard the Arizona. These were not just statistics. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, who woke up that Sunday morning with plans and dreams and futures, and who never saw another sunrise. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed the course of the Second World War and, indeed, of the 20th century. It brought the United States into a conflict that would reshape the world order. The industrial might of America, once awakened, proved overwhelming. Within 4 years, the same Japanese empire that launched the surprise attack would be brought to its knees. The war in the Pacific would be brutal and costly, claiming millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific Islands. It would end only with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, opening the door to the nuclear age. But on that December morning in 1941, none of that was yet known. What was known was this: the peaceful Sunday morning had been shattered by fire and fury. A sneak attack had killed thousands. A nation had been awakened to the realities of a world at war. And the course of history had been forever altered by 2 hours of violence in a Hawaiian harbor. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, is reported to have said afterward, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually spoke these words is debated by historians. But the sentiment proved prophetic. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. It united and enraged America rather than intimidating it into submission. It brought into the war a nation with unmatched industrial capacity and a now unshakable determination to win. But the story of Pearl Harbor does not end with the last Japanese plane disappearing into the clouds. In many ways, the story was just beginning. Because what happened in the hours, days, and months after the attack would prove just as dramatic as the attack itself. This is the story of how America rose from the ashes, how ordinary people became warriors, and how a nation transformed itself into the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, as smoke still billowed from burning ships and bodies were still being pulled from the water, the survivors faced a terrifying question. Would the Japanese come back? Intelligence reports suggested that a Japanese invasion force might be approaching Hawaii. False alarms and rumors spread like wildfire. Every airplane in the sky was seen as a potential enemy. Machine gunners fired at shadows. Civilians dug trenches and prepared for street fighting. Martial law was declared across Hawaii. The islands blacked out at night with not a single light visible from shore. People taped their windows, stored emergency supplies, and wondered if they would wake up to the sound of Japanese landing craft on the beaches. General Walter Short and Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Army and Navy commanders at Pearl Harbor, faced immediate questions about how such a devastating surprise attack could have occurred. How had the Japanese fleet crossed thousands of miles of ocean undetected? Why weren't aircraft on patrol? Why were ships bunched together in the harbor, making them easy targets? Why weren't anti-aircraft guns fully manned on a Sunday morning when intelligence had warned that Japan might strike somewhere in the Pacific? These questions would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Within weeks, both were relieved of command. Multiple investigations would follow, assigning blame, analyzing failures, and trying to understand how the disaster had happened. But blame and investigations had to wait. There was immediate work to do. The harbor had to be cleared. Ships had to be salvaged. The wounded had to be cared for. And the dead had to be honored. In the days following the attack, burial details worked around the clock. Many bodies were so badly burned that identification was impossible. Others were never recovered, entombed forever in the sunken ships. Mass graves were dug at military cemeteries. Chaplains conducted service after service, reading the same solemn words over and over as flag-draped coffins were lowered into the ground. For the families back on the mainland, the news arrived in the cruelest possible way. Telegrams began appearing at front doors across America. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son. Mothers collapsed in their kitchens. Fathers stared at the yellow paper in disbelief. Wives became widows. Children lost fathers they barely knew. In some small towns, multiple telegrams arrived on the same day, and entire communities went into mourning. The Sullivan brothers of Iowa would later become famous when all five died together on the USS Juneau, but Pearl Harbor had already claimed numerous sets of brothers, and the grief rippled through communities like a dark wave. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor became one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the war. Navy divers worked in the murky oil-filled water, often in complete darkness, cutting through twisted metal to reach trapped compartments. They used underwater torches, creating dangerous sparks in areas that might contain pockets of explosive gas. They worked in shifts around the clock, driven by the knowledge that time was critical. Some men were still alive in air pockets inside the sunken ships, and every hour mattered. The tapping sounds from inside the Oklahoma gradually grew weaker, then stopped. The last survivor was rescued 32 hours after the ship capsized, but many others were never reached in time. The California, which had settled to the bottom in the shallow water, presented unique challenges. Salvage crews had to seal hundreds of holes in her hull, then pump out millions of gallons of water. It took 3 months just to raise her. The West Virginia required similar efforts. Both ships were so badly damaged that many believed they should be scrapped. But America needed every ship it could get, and the decision was made to repair them. They were patched up enough to float, then sent to the West Coast for complete reconstruction. They would return to service in 1944, in time to participate in the final battles of the Pacific War. While salvage crews worked in Pearl Harbor, the rest of America was transforming at breathtaking speed. The attack had galvanized the nation in a way nothing else could have. Factories that had been running one shift went to 3 shifts, operating 24 hours a day. Assembly lines that had produced cars now produced tanks. Companies that had made washing machines now made ammunition. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, which would become famous for producing B-24 bombers, wasn't even built yet when Pearl Harbor was attacked. But within a year, it would be churning out 1 bomber every hour. Women entered the workforce in numbers that would have been unimaginable just months before. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of this transformation. Women who had been housewives, teachers, and shop clerks became welders, riveters, and machine operators. They built ships, assembled aircraft, and manufactured munitions. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, workers set a record by building an entire Liberty ship in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. It was a feat of industrial mobilization that the world had never seen before and would never see again. But building ships and planes was only part of the challenge. America needed soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and it needed them fast. Draft boards across the country worked overtime to process millions of young men. Training camps that had been nearly empty in 1940 were overflowing by 1942. Young men who had never been more than 50 miles from their hometowns found themselves on troop ships heading to the South Pacific or North Africa. Farm boys learned to operate tanks. City kids learned to navigate by the stars. College students became bomber pilots. The transformation was often brutal. Basic training lasted just weeks, and then these newly minted soldiers were thrown into combat. In the Pacific, the situation remained desperate throughout the first half of 1942. The Japanese, emboldened by their success at Pearl Harbor, launched attacks across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February. The Philippines, an American Commonwealth, held out longer but ultimately fell in May. General Douglas MacArthur, forced to evacuate, made his famous promise, "I shall return." Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were captured and forced on the notorious Bataan Death March, during which thousands died from exhaustion, disease, and brutal treatment by their captors. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. They took Burma, threatening India. They seized the Dutch East Indies, gaining the oil fields they had needed all along. They pushed into New Guinea within striking distance of Australia. American forces, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperate holding actions. But there were small victories that kept hope alive. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 Army B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The raid caused minimal physical damage, but its psychological impact was enormous. It proved that Japan was vulnerable, that America could strike back, and it lifted American morale at a critical moment. Then came the turning point. In early June 1942, American intelligence discovered that a massive Japanese fleet was approaching Midway Island, a tiny atoll about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had replaced Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet, made a bold decision. He would set a trap. Despite being outnumbered, he positioned his carriers northeast of Midway and waited. The Japanese had 4 fleet carriers in their strike force. The Americans had 3. On paper, Japan had the advantage. But the Americans had something more valuable. They knew the Japanese were coming. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It was a battle fought almost entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. In the opening hours, things went badly for the Americans. Wave after wave of American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers, and were shot down in appalling numbers. Of 15 torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet, 14 were destroyed. The survivors limped back to their carriers, having scored no hits. The Japanese seemed invincible, just as they had at Pearl Harbor. But then fortune turned. At the exact moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, with their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, American dive bombers appeared overhead. In a span of just 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were hit by multiple bombs and set ablaze. Aviation fuel, torpedoes, and bombs on their decks exploded in massive fireballs. By the end of the day, all 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk, along with a heavy cruiser and over 300 aircraft. The cream of Japan's naval aviation, the same pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, went down with their ships. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, and 1 destroyer. It was the most decisive naval victory in American history. Midway changed everything. The Japanese advance was halted. The initiative passed to the Americans. From that point forward, Japan would be on the defensive. But the war was far from over. It would take 3 more years of brutal fighting across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle before Japan would finally surrender. The campaigns that followed Midway would become legendary. Guadalcanal, where Marines fought in sweltering jungle for 6 months to hold a single airstrip. Tarawa, where Marines had to wade ashore through chest-deep water under withering machine gun fire, suffering 3,000 casualties in 76 hours. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each battle more costly than the last. But in every one of those battles, the shadow of Pearl Harbor loomed large. American commanders remembered the price of being caught unprepared. American sailors remembered their comrades who had died in the burning ships. And American soldiers and Marines, when the fighting seemed unbearable and the casualties mounted, remembered why they were there. They were avenging Pearl Harbor. They were ensuring that such a sneak attack could never happen again. They were finishing what had been started on that December morning. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, those who had survived the attack, carried their memories throughout the war and for the rest of their lives. Some went on to distinguished careers. Dory Miller, the mess attendant who had manned the machine gun on the West Virginia, was promoted and sent on a war bond tour. He returned to sea duty in 1943 and was killed when his ship, the escort carrier Liscum Bay, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. He was 24 years old. His heroism at Pearl Harbor had made him one of the most famous African Americans in the military, and his death was mourned nationwide. Others returned to Pearl Harbor in different roles. Some became trainers, teaching new sailors the lessons learned in blood that December morning. Some worked in the shipyards helping to repair and rebuild the fleet. Some flew patrol missions, constantly scanning the horizon for threats. The hypervigilance never left them. 4 years afterward, many veterans would wake at night to the sound of aircraft engines, their hearts pounding, convinced for a moment that the attack was happening again. The ships that were salvaged and repaired became symbols of American resilience. The battleship Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock during the attack and therefore escaped the worst damage, went on to serve throughout the war. She bombarded Japanese positions at Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam and Okinawa. The Nevada, which had been run aground to prevent blocking the harbor, was refloated, repaired, and sent first to the Atlantic, where she supported the D-Day landings at Normandy. Then she returned to the Pacific for the final campaigns. The West Virginia and California, both sunk at their moorings on December 7, were not just repaired but completely modernized. They participated in the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, where they helped annihilate a Japanese fleet in what would be the last battleship versus battleship action in history. It was a form of revenge, shooting at the Japanese fleet with the very guns that the Japanese had tried to sink 3 years earlier. The investigation into the Pearl Harbor attack continued throughout the war and for years afterward. 8 different investigations were conducted, including a congressional inquiry that lasted from November 1945 to May 1946. The questions were endless. Had Washington provided adequate warning to the commanders in Hawaii? Should the commanders in Hawaii have been more vigilant? Could better intelligence have prevented the attack? Were there organizational failures in how information was shared between the Army and Navy? The investigations produced thousands of pages of testimony and analysis, but even today historians debate exactly where responsibility should lie. What became clear was that the attack succeeded because of a combination of factors. Japanese operational security was excellent. Their fleet crossed the Pacific undetected through a combination of luck, skill, and taking a northern route where merchant traffic was minimal. American intelligence, while it had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, had not broken the naval codes being used to coordinate the attack. The information that Washington did have about Japanese intentions was not clearly communicated to Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders on the scene, did not coordinate effectively with each other. They had taken some precautions but not enough. Aircraft were grouped together on airfields to prevent sabotage, but this made them vulnerable to air attack. Ships were in port because it was a weekend. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked up. Radar detected the incoming Japanese planes, but the operators assumed they were American B-17 bombers expected from California. In the end, the disaster at Pearl Harbor became a case study in how not to be prepared for war. Military academies would study it for decades, teaching officers about the importance of intelligence, coordination, readiness, and never underestimating an opponent. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry not just for revenge, but for vigilance. It was a reminder that threats can come when least expected, that complacency is dangerous, and that the price of unpreparedness can be measured in thousands of lives. As the war progressed, the focus shifted from who was to blame for Pearl Harbor to how to win the war. By 1943, American industrial production had reached levels that staggered the imagination. In that year alone, American factories produced 86,000 aircraft. Japanese factories produced 16,000. The disparity in shipbuilding was even more dramatic. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched more than 50 aircraft carriers of various types. Japan launched 17. The sleeping giant, that Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening, was now fully aroused, and its productive capacity was overwhelming. The human cost of the Pacific War was staggering. American casualties exceeded 400,000, including over 100,000 dead. Japanese casualties were in the millions, including hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in bombing raids and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions of Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, and other Asian civilians died as the war swept across the continent. The brutality of the fighting exceeded anything in the European theater. Soldiers on both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were often executed rather than taken. The Japanese military's treatment of prisoners of war was particularly brutal, violating international conventions. American soldiers, remembering Pearl Harbor and learning of Japanese war crimes, often fought with a fury born of rage. On September 2, 1945, exactly 3 years, 8 months and 26 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, representatives of the Japanese government boarded the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay and signed the instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. Representatives of all the Allied powers were present. Above the ceremony, hanging from a bulkhead, was the same American flag that had flown over the U.S. Capitol on December 7, 1941. It had been sent to the Pacific specifically for this moment. The symbolism was clear. The war that had begun with a surprise attack was ending with Japan's complete and unconditional surrender. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had commanded the Pacific Fleet throughout the war, signed on behalf of the United States. After the ceremony, he made a statement that captured the magnitude of what had been achieved. The war that began at Pearl Harbor had ended on this day. A new era of peace and understanding among nations is beginning. But he also cautioned, we must ensure that the sacrifice of those who died was not in vain. We must build a world where such a war can never happen again. The survivors of Pearl Harbor watched the surrender ceremony with mixed emotions. There was relief that the war was finally over. There was pride in victory. But there was also sadness for all those who had not lived to see this day. The men still entombed in the Arizona. The classmates and shipmates who had died on other ships in other battles across the vast Pacific. The victory was total, but the cost had been enormous. In the decades after the war, Pearl Harbor became enshrined in American memory. The Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, designed by architect Alfred Prees, himself a refugee from Nazi-occupied Austria. The memorial spans the sunken ship without touching it, allowing visitors to look down at the rusted hull visible just beneath the water's surface. In a shrine room at the end of the memorial, a marble wall is inscribed with the names of all 1,177 men who died aboard the ship. Fresh flowers are often left there, and visitors speak in hushed, reverent tones. Each year on December 7th, a ceremony is held at Pearl Harbor. Fewer and fewer survivors attend with each passing year. In 2025, only a handful remain, all well over 100 years old. They come in wheelchairs now, old men whose hands shake as they salute the flag. But their eyes still carry the memories of that morning when they were young, when the sky exploded with fire, when their world changed forever. They come to honor their fallen comrades, to ensure that the story is told, and to remind new generations of the price of freedom. The lessons of Pearl Harbor extend far beyond military history. They speak to fundamental questions about human nature, about nations, about war and peace. The attack demonstrated how quickly peace can turn to war, how vulnerable even the strongest can be to surprise, and how nations can underestimate their opponents with disastrous results. It showed that technological superiority alone is not enough without vigilance and preparedness. It revealed how quickly ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary heroism when circumstances demand it. Pearl Harbor also revealed the darker aspects of war. In the aftermath of the attack, fear and prejudice led to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the internment of Japanese Americans. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and placed in detention camps. They lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom, all because they looked like the enemy. Many of their sons, despite this injustice, volunteered to fight for America. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. They proved their loyalty in blood, fighting in Italy and France while their families remained behind barbed wire. It would take decades before the government formally apologized for this violation of civil rights. The strategic implications of Pearl Harbor reshaped American defense policy for generations. Never again would the United States allow itself to be caught so unprepared. The attack led directly to the creation of what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex, a permanent state of military readiness that continues to this day. It led to massive investments in intelligence capabilities, early warning systems, and forward-deployed forces around the world. The phrase, "No more Pearl Harbors," became a guiding principle of American national security policy. The attack also fundamentally changed warfare itself. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the supremacy of aircraft carriers over battleships. The battleship, which had dominated naval warfare for centuries, was suddenly obsolete. The carrier became the new capital ship, and naval strategy was rewritten around it. The attack showed the devastating potential of air power and accelerated the development of strategic bombing campaigns. It foreshadowed the coming importance of intelligence and code-breaking in modern warfare. And it demonstrated that in the modern era, wars could begin with devastating speed, without warning, from enemies striking from thousands of miles away. Today, more than 8 decades later, the waters of Pearl Harbor are peaceful again. The harbor serves as a naval base as it did then. Tour boats carry visitors past the memorial where the Arizona rests. Survivors of the attack, now in their hundreds, return each year to remember their fallen comrades. Their numbers grow fewer with each passing year. Soon there will be none left who can say, "I was there." But their story and the story of December 7th, 1941, will never be forgotten. It stands as a reminder of the price of unpreparedness, of the devastating surprise that warfare can bring, and of the courage of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It reminds us that peace is precious and fragile, that war brings suffering beyond measure, and that sometimes history pivots on a single moment, a single day that changes everything. On that Sunday morning, 2,500 souls went from peace to eternity in a matter of hours. Ships that had seemed invincible became burning tombs. A harbor that had been secure became a scene of chaos. And a nation that had tried to stay out of the world's troubles found itself thrust into the greatest conflict in human history. The date did live in infamy just as President Roosevelt predicted. And from that infamy came a resolve that would not be broken until victory was won and the forces that brought such destruction were defeated. But Pearl Harbor is more than a story of death and destruction. It is a story of resilience, of a nation that rose from disaster to achieve victory. It is a story of ordinary people who became heroes, of workers who built the ships and planes that won the war, of soldiers and sailors who fought across half the world. It is a story of sacrifice and determination, of unity forged in the fires of adversity. It is a reminder that from the darkest moments can come the strongest resolve, that defeat can be the prelude to victory, and that the human spirit, when tested, can overcome seemingly impossible odds. This is the complete story of Pearl Harbor. This is the story of the day that changed the world and of everything that followed after.